Hello, I'm Phoebe Boucher, Managing Editor of Raven Chronicles Press. Thank you for joining us this evening for Raven Talk. We are hosting monthly conversations with writers, artists, and cultural warriors. Today, writer Kathleen Alcalá is talking to David Olivas about his recent publication from the University of Nevada Press, How to Date a Flying Mexican, a collection of short stories derived from Chicano and Mexican culture, but ranging through fascinating literary worlds of magic realism, fairy tales, fables, and dystopian futures. There will be time for questions at the end. Tom Stiles, our engineer from Jack Straw Cultural Center, will be posting stuff in the chat. If you have any questions or comments, put them in and somebody will be reading them. We want to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples and that we occupy this land. Thanks to our co-sponsors tonight for partial funding of all Raven programs, the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, For Culture, King County Lodging Tax, the Washington State Arts Commission, with NEA funding for project support, which we get each year. And always thanks to all our individual donors. Kathleen Alcalá was born in Compton, California, to Mexican parents and grew up in San Bernardino. She has a degree in linguistics from Stanford University, an MA in creative writing from the University of Washington, and an MFA from the University of New Orleans. A graduate of the Clarion West Science Fiction and Fantasy program, her work embraces both traditional and innovative storytelling. She's the author of 6 books that include a collection of stories, 3 novels, a book of essays, and The Deepest Roots, Finding Food and Community on a Pacific Northwest Island, which was published by the University of Washington Press. She lives on Bainwood Bridge Island near Seattle, where she has been designated an island treasure. She's always been my treasure. Daniel Olivas is the author of 10 books and an editor of 2 anthologies. His books include How to Date a Flying Mexican, New and Collected Stories, the University of Nevada Press, The King of Lighting Fixtures Stories, the University of Arizona Press, Crossing the Border, Collected Poems, Pact Press, and Things We Do Not Talk About, Exploring Latina Literature Through Essays and Interviews, San Diego State University. Daniel's plays have been produced for the stage. Widely anthologized, Dan has written for many publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, El Paso Times, Huffington Post, High Country News, La Bloga, Bomb, and the Jewish Journal. Kathleen, take it away.
All righty. Thank you, Phoebe. And hello, Daniel. How are you?
Hi, Kathleen. Well, thank you. Thank you to Raven Chronicles and Phoebe and Kathleen for having me. This is very special to me. Thank you.
Well, I enjoy your writing very much. I have to say, full disclosure, Daniel's cousin, Sally, was one of my roommates in college.
That's right.
At the time, Daniel was probably about 10 years old.
No.
I'll bet you were.
I was in high school, probably getting ready to go
you
to
were in
Stanford.
high school.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I enjoyed reading How to Date a Flying Mexican. And I think I identified with all these people. I wanted to start with your title story, How to Date a Flying Mexican, because it implies supernatural forces that are part of everyday life for the people in the story. But I can't help but think this is metaphorical for cultural assumptions that we contend with every day. You find yourself having to explain things to people that seem perfectly commonplace to you, Daniel?
Well, I think that growing up in the Mexican-American culture, I was raised Catholic, though I converted to Judaism as an adult. The whole concept of the afterlife and this physical life were almost one and the same. The stories my parents told me, the stories my grandmother told me, didn't really often distinguish between the living and the dead. And the title story How to Date a Flying Mexican, which is actually a chapter from a novel called The Book of Want, grapples with a few things. Number one, it grapples with sexism within the culture and within the Catholic religion, in terms of how Conchita, my main character, is often mocked and guilted into trying to live a more traditional life. She's a woman who's in her early 60s, who never married and never needs to marry, and loves to have different men in her life. She eventually falls in love with someone who can levitate, who can fly. And in that story, a recurring character is her dead mother, who shows up at very embarrassing times, including after she's made love with her new boyfriend, and she cajoles and she, interferes, just the way she did in the life that she lived as on this earth. So for someone who grows up in the culture that I grew up in, it feels very natural to tell these kinds of stories. For reviewers and other folks who come from other cultures who don't really have that kind of connection, sometimes I find myself having to explain what I'm trying to do. One of the beauties of magical realism is you can have magic that basically points to or heightens reality, heightens the issues that we deal with as people. And the magical elements are just very normal parts of what will occur with the characters in the story. Certainly, when I teach my books, when I'm a guest author at colleges, for example, and where I have students who come from similar culture that I do, the kids often say, "Oh, I saw my grandmother.
I knew someone who could fly, right?"
Yeah. Or I've seen my grandmother, or my grandmother would tell stories about so and so who had magical powers, and you know what? I really believe what she said, and so there are people who share these type of storytelling cultural touchstones that I try to express in my stories.
Yes, and I think across all cultures is that notion of, oh, what if I could fly? What if I could fly? It's just something that captures all of us, and makes us think about, well, what magical things do exist in my life.
And one of the things which this collection does is it's a collection of my favorite stories I've had published in collections or in a novel over almost 25 years of writing, with a couple of brand new stories. And the title story ended up being the title story because it was my late father's favorite story of mine. My father passed in 2020 after fighting lung disease for many years. And he was a person who had wanted to be a writer and never got published. So he destroyed all his writing, and he got educated, and he raised his family. And so he loved to talk about my writing life. It was something very special for him. And this particular story, How to Date a Flying Mexican, just made him laugh so much. And he just enjoyed the whimsy of it all.
Right.
So.
Yes, my father too aspired to be a writer, but he didn't write very much. I think there was a big gap between the idea of being a writer and the reality of having to get more than 2 or 3 pages done at a time. So I think it just remained in that area with flying Mexicans. I wanted to ask you about After the Revolution, one of your stories, which is about people in a village trying to cope with the new world order after the Mexican Revolution. In the old world, major life decisions were made by the group or by the patriarch of the family. But in this story, you bring to the fore both the freedoms and limitations of life where social norms have been upended. A couple sit across from each other at dinner and wonder, why be alone? Life is so short. why not this one? And do you have a couple of paragraphs you could read us out of that?
Sure. Now, for those who don't know, the Mexican Revolution lasted more than 10 years. And my grandparents migrated to the United States around 1920, which is just coming off of the tail end of the Mexican Revolution and the violence that that occurred. And they settled in Los Angeles. And it was indeed a new world order. And so let me just read a couple of the opening paragraphs from that story after the revolution, just so you can get a sense of how I set the table for the story. After the revolution, after the last ringing "Basta ya" echoed through the plazas, calles, and ranchos of Mexico, after the murders of Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa, and after the drafting of the new Mexican Constitution, Lázaro Mayo Cisneros worked with all his soul, all his essence, all his sweat to rebuild his wealth and power. The agrarian reforms inexorably led to the confiscation, division, and distribution of Lázaro's once vast, lush rancho. Out of pity, the revolutionaries left him with a few acres of rocky terrain at the outer edges of the pueblo. But he was a realist. Lázaro asked himself, what could I do with all that wonderful grazing land when my fine cattle has been taken away as well? And he answered, después de la lluvia sale el sol. Things must get better after such a calamity, no? Lázaro looked in the mirror and saw a healthy man of 32 years. The revolutionaries could not take this from him, so he accepted the unusable acres with a smile and an elegant bow, and pledged on the memory of his late parents to begin anew in this measureless land of Mexico.
Thank you. And that very much parallels some of the stories in my family. Both of my parents came with their own birth families as refugees during the Mexican Revolution. And there was land in Mexico that a few people got to hang on to. And the story goes that the woman who ended up owning what was left said, fine, I'll give it to the revolution if you promise to make it into an agricultural college. And they did. And this is in Saltillo, Mexico.
Wow.
So who knows if that's true, but it makes a good story.
It does. And it's interesting that you have those kind of connections as do I. And the fact that, my grandparents came to this country in 1920. So my people have been here for 100 years.
Yeah.
Yet I've been stopped by ICE while on an Amtrak going to work in San Diego from LA. I've been called a stupid Mexican by a high school football coach. I've been stopped by police while walking in my neighborhood when I was in high school and searched just because I had a gym bag and I was going to football practice. I was an A student at Loyola High School, by the way, walking in my neighborhood, just being stopped, but, walking while brown. And despite the fact that my people have been in this country for 100 years, I'm still considered a foreigner by some.
Right. So in After the Revolution, again, I feel like so much more could be implied by what the people are asking. Why not this one? And I wanted you to tell us a little bit about what happens when Martha, who's the housekeeper, decides she's going to take things into her own hands.
So that story is sort of a fable in a sense. My lead character, Lázaro, after he has rebuilt his wealth and he is now doing quite well, he decides that he needs to marry. And so because
it's all a little clinical, isn't it?
Yes, because he's an engineer by training. And so what he ends up drawing up a list a very careful list of the eligible women in the town, with their, the pluses and minuses for each one. And he ends up showing it to his housekeeper, who begins to panic because she feels like she's been like almost like the queen of the house. She's,
Right.
she's
been in charge.
she's been in charge, and she likes her station. And so she looks at this list, and she does a calculation. She tries to figure out which person is the best person for her in terms of being able to keep control of the house. And so she ends up giving her input, and based on her input, a decision is made. And so he starts to court Socorro, and the courting doesn't go very well, because she is a very smart person who doesn't like to be manipulated. But eventually they marry. But it doesn't turn out so well for the housekeeper, because Socorro begins to like take over certain duties within the house, because she's not a lazy person. She wants to do things. She's always, been industrious. And so the housekeeper decides that she will rely upon some magic, go to the curandera in town to get a little help with magic. And it of course backfires rather dramatically. I don't want to give the ending, but
No, please don't.
as with many of my fables and my retelling of folktales, things don't work out the way people intend them to, because their intentions aren't necessarily the best intentions. But what I was trying to express in some ways, some of the kind of classic dynamics of men and women in terms of their gender identity and roles during that time, 100 years ago. So, and many of those elements still exist today.
Right.
And you could maybe even rewrite this story in the present day, and you could, maybe perhaps mix up the different genders and move things around. But there are dynamics that are out there that are imposed by society about what is the proper way to live. Again, getting married and having kids, and the more traditional ways of living your life, which is not always the best way to live a life. For everybody. Everyone has a different path. Everyone has a different way to be fulfilled, and is not one size fits all.
Right. And I think when I read these stories, and I think about my parents, because they both grew up with very traditional ideas, even though they didn't, their families themselves didn't conform to those ideas, but they each came out of it with these notions of how people should behave, and what are appropriate jobs for different people. I have one sister who was a teacher and one sister who was a nurse, and those were pretty much the two things that one ought to do or could do before she, of course, married and stopped working to have babies, right? So you come across that fairly often. Talking about the dichos, and you said that your father was interested in writing, and did he start his stories based on dichos?
So the very sad part about my dad's writing was that he destroyed everything. He did not save anything. So I've never read.
So you never read any of it?
I've never
goodness.
read. I've only heard him tell stories, as I also heard my mother, who was still alive, tell stories, and my grandmother tell stories. But so I never got to see what his writing looked like. He had worked in a factory in Watts when I was young. I'm in the middle of 5 children, and he wrote an old Royal Deluxe typewriter, which was Hemingway's favorite typewriter, and I still have. I inherited it.
Great.
Yeah, it's 17 pounds of this mid-century um, uh, light brown metal. It's a beautiful machine. And he would type his stories and he would write his poetry during the day because he worked night shift. And he said that he would do that while I was in a crib next to him. And I, as a baby,
So you
as
grew
an
up
infant,
with that sound.
with the sound of
Interesting.
typing. So he said that's probably why I became a writer, because I was an infant and he was typing. And then, he, like I said, he destroyed all his writing. So I don't know how he began his stories, but those Mexican sayings, those dichos, those little bite-sized bits of wisdom are just wonderful ways to express, I think, an idea, but also the kind of very common sense way we as Mexicans think, and I'll just do it in English because my English is better than my Spanish. But there are phrases like there isn't a rose without thorns, or my bag is heavy, but at least it's my bag, or don't look for a third horn on a bull. These are wonderful kind of
In boca
smart.
cerrada no entran moscas.
Yes.
So I remember.
And or something as simple as after the rain must come the sun, which is in the excerpt I read. A lot of the sayings that I heard growing up, and that I researched as well, that I bought a book on dichos, a wonderful collection on dichos. They're just very commonsensical.
Yes, people are putting up some dichos now in the chat.
Oh.
They're remembering, because everyone grew up hearing different ones from relatives and from their parents.
Yes. Estela, yes, I love that one. In fact, I think I used that in one of my stories. So I think it's a wonderful way to express the culture and express where we come from as a people.
Yes, thank you. Well, I was curious about your day job for the state of California. Many of your stories start with a dicho at its heart. Oh no, wait, this is the next part, including some that show up in some of the stories that might be based on cases that you've had. You want to talk about that? Tell people what you do first.
Yeah, I'll tell people what I do. So I am a senior assistant attorney general with the California Department of Justice. I am in charge of the land use and conservation section. And so I run a team of about 45 attorneys and paralegals for the state of California Attorney General's office. And we specialize in land use, environmental enforcement, affordable housing as well. What I try to do is I try not to write about my cases. I have to be very careful.
You can't write about your cases.
Well, yeah, I have to be very, very careful not to do anything that could in any way prejudice, the cases or my work. But that doesn't mean my stories do not include at times characters who work at office like my office. And there is one story in particular that I mentioned in my introduction, a story called "Good Things Happen at Tina's Cafe," which explicitly happens within the office. I work in the Ronald Reagan building in downtown Los Angeles. And that story is a magical realism story, and it involves a secretary who works for the Public Rights Division. And he has an anomaly. He has 6 fingers on each hand. And basically he grapples with being mocked his entire life. And so his father, when he was young, tried to get a curandero to help him, and that failed miserably. And there's a little conversation in that story where that curandero says, "Hey, why don't you just have your son have surgery? And the father says, the insurance won't cover it. What do you mean insurance won't cover it? Well, all his fingers actually work. So it would be considered cosmetic surgery. So there'd be no coverage. And so, and eventually he meets a woman named Tina who runs a cafe, and they begin a relationship. They go on a first date, and I won't again give away the ending, but there's the question of what society expects from us, and also what would we trade if we could, in order to be more accepted by society at large. So what happened was, one day I was sitting around. I used to work in the consumer law section. I was sitting around during lunch with some of my compatriots from the section, and a lot of my friends are supportive of my writing. And I think someone suggested, why don't you write a story and put us in it? So I said, okay. So in the story, there's a Tina, and there's a Mike, and there's a Barney. So there are people who are actually from that group of friends. And the reason why it's called Tina's Cafe is there's a couple within the consumer section in LA, Barney and Tina. They're both lawyers, and they're married to each other. Tina has had a coffee maker in her office, and we all called it Tina's Cafe. So in the morning, at mid-morning, we go in, make coffee, and we talk about the cases and just about life, and then go back to our offices. So I created a Tina's Cafe that's a real cafe, a more cafe-like, and put into story. In order to create even more of a meta element for that story, one of the attorneys created how shall I put it, a Yelp page that maybe wasn't real for Tina's Cafe, and posted pictures from the office with the coffee pot and things like that, and people started putting fake reviews. So there's actually a Tina's Cafe that's on Yelp that doesn't truly exist.
It's based on this cafe. It's based on this cafe, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Exactly.
I'm glad to hear that, because that was one story I felt was a little bit more grounded in real day-to-day life, as you may see it or other people might see it.
Well, it's
the fact that you described specific locations in Los Angeles, including the Angel's Flight.
Angel's Flight, and it's based right there off of Spring Street in downtown LA. The Ronald Reagan building is mentioned, and then if you took Angel's Flight up to California Plaza, there's the Panda Express, which is also part of the story, and then there's a Starbucks up there that became part of the story.
Right.
And one of the things my mom said a long time ago when I first started writing was she felt like some of my stories were like little bits of history, because over time, some of the places that I wrote about disappeared. They went under. And she noted, I think very wisely, that someone could read some of my stories and come from LA and recognize the different places and realize, oh my gosh, I used to go there, doesn't exist anymore. And but it's in this story. So those are little kind of Easter eggs for people who know. And
I have to say that as one of the younger people in my family, and my parents were so much older, much of my experience of Los Angeles was the Los Angeles that's no longer there. This is where this used to be, and this is where we used to come to this all-you-could-eat buffet, and all the different things that people remember from earlier in their lives, but they're not there. It's like people who give directions by landmarks that no longer exist, right?
Yes, exactly.
So I had very much that feeling as I read this story. So besides prose and poetry, you also write plays. And I wondered what set you off in that direction.
So first, let me just say I do not have an MFA. I don't know how many writers I know there are several writers on the screen right now and perhaps watching through Facebook. So I'm self-taught. I'm self-taught by reading. And a couple years ago, when President Trump was pushing his family separation policy and causing a true humanitarian crisis with families that were being torn apart, I felt like, and I'd already addressed his immigration policies through fiction and through essays. I felt like I needed to humanize, the damage done in a way that went beyond a book. And so I decided I was going to write a play. And I thought that the best type of play to write would be a absurdist play. And of course, one of our great absurdist playwrights, Samuel Beckett, was a perfect place to go for inspiration. So I reread Waiting for Godot, read it many times, and watched about 4 different versions. There's even a Spanish version, which is crazy. There's a wonderful version from that was on television back in the early '60s with Burgess Meredith and Zero Mostel in the lead roles. So I watched a bunch of different versions, and it finally dawned on me. I knew what my story would be, and the basic story of Waiting for Godot. You got, Vladimir and Estragon, who are waiting for this mysterious person who never shows up. He never shows up in the play, and they have very strange, funny, absurdist banter, and they have encounters with a couple other people who are rather odd. So in my play, in Beckett's play, all the characters are male. Mine are mixed. So in my play, I have 2 characters known as Chuy and Chavalita, and they're waiting for a guy named Godinez. And in the Godot play, every night Estragon is beaten up and thrown in a ditch every single night. Same thing, never changes, and then he comes back to be with Vladimir. In my play, Chuy is snatched up by ICE every single night and thrown into a cage to be deported. And every night he escapes to come back to be with his friend Chavalita to wait for Godinez. And so I studied how to format a play. I wrote the play and then just submitted it to theaters, and it got picked up for readings. And it's still available online with the Road Theater. If you Google it, the Road Theater and Waiting for Godinez, it'll come up. You can watch the reading. It's a beautiful reading. It was also done in a reading that was not recorded by Playwrights Arena. And then we did Playwrights Arena did a full pandemic version of it, live, in person, outdoors with masks last summer. And so there's a lot of humor in the play, but there's a lot of great, heartbreak in the play. I won't give away what the real kind of turning point is in the play, but there's a shock revelation in the play. And in working with my actors in rehearsal, in each of these productions, I had some actors in tears because
did you direct?
No, professional directors. So in each of these productions are all professional theaters, professional directors, and the directors worked with them, and in particular, knowing that the subject matter could be very difficult. We had discussions about the triggering issues being raised within the story, and there's nothing that humanizes literature like having someone perform. And these are all actors who are professional actors, some of whom we've seen on TV, and they just brought so much heart to their roles. But that's why I started writing plays. I wanted to humanize to an even larger extent what I saw as being just a really a horrendous humanitarian crisis going on.
Yeah.
And in this collection, I do have two Trump-related stories. One's a dystopian future, and one's a magical realism piece. And even though I think those stories are effective, I think there's really nothing like having actors speak your words and perform the narrative.
It's so startling to someone like me who just writes prose on the page to suddenly have something I wrote taken and turned into 3 dimensions that way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you arranged the collection this way on purpose or not, but I also felt that from the beginning to the ending story, we start out with the dichos, and we start out with the kind of conformity that people feel they have to do to societal norms. But the later stories also have more depth to the characters. I feel as though you took the dichos and really filled them out with how these things manifest themselves in the world. And I really enjoyed that aspect of this collection, of having it arranged that way, or at least that's the way I read it.
Well, arranging the collection, to me, or arranging any short story collection for me, is what I imagine arranging a jazz album or concept album.
Mm-hmm.
If I were a musician, and if I were, when the tracks of Kind of Blue or Sergeant Pepper's or whatever are laid down and ordered, they're not recorded in that order, they're recorded in many different orders, and these stories in the same way were written over many different years in different decades. And so I had to think about rhythm and
Yes.
and what the feel would be if someone started reading this collection. Beginning with this particular story, How to Date a Fly Mexican, it's a little bit of a head fake in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Because certainly not all the stories are like that story. That story has a lot of humor in it. It's also structured in a how-to format, rule
Yes.
number 1, rule number 2.
Right.
So not every single story in the collection runs its course in that way. Some are very short, some are dreamlike, like Driving to Ventura, about a woman who is in an abusive relationship, but who very bravely fights back. That's written in almost a dreamlike, episodic way. In the same way, someone who has suffered trauma may recall their life from childhood through the abusive relationship, and how that happened, how they ended up in that relationship. So I use a lot of different techniques. One of the things I never want to be is I never want to be bored by writing. I want to have every single story that I start to be an exciting adventure for me, because I'm a selfish person and it's all about me. And I want it to be the type of thing where if I am bored, I'm going to abandon that story.
Well, and if the writer is bored, the story is probably boring, right?
Right. It's it's sort of like sunk costs. Some writers think, oh my God, I've written 4,000 words. I have to keep on going, even though I'm not really liking this and I don't think it works, but they feel like, oh my God, I can't toss these pages. You know what? You have to be willing to abandon, but also you have to be willing to be true to yourself, to understand why you're a writer. I'm a writer not because I think I'm going to get rich for my writing. I'm a writer because it is.
You don't.
No. I'm a writer because I'm an artist. It is artistic expression. It is as if I were a sculptor or a painter or a dancer. It is an artistic expression, and it is something I have to do. I am incapable of not writing. And that's why, breaking out and doing other types of writing, like playwriting, was really exciting. And I've written several plays already, and I enjoy a challenge. One of the most exciting things for me as a writer is when I am stuck in a corner and I don't know how the heck I'm going to get out of it. And then I get to think about it. I sleep on it. I just think about it. I let days go by. And that's okay. I think that's perfectly fine. That's not writer's block. That's part of the process.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. Let's open it up now if people have any questions for him about the writing process or about his subject matter or traffic in LA. I don't know.
Any questions? Comments?
Can the people in Facebook, are they able to send you any?
Can they speak to you? Oh, I was sure some of you would have a question for Daniel.
Estela.
Yes, Estela.
Hey, Daniel. I know
Hey.
as a fellow LA writer, like what especially inspires you? How does LA especially inspire you to write these stories? What makes it such a creative source for you?
So one of the beauties of the city is that there's so many sounds and voices and languages and foods and music when you go out. And I've noticed that a lot of my stories take place like at street level. People are walking through the streets and they're seeing things and interacting with people. It is a very vibrant city. At the same time, it can be a very lonely city for a lot of people. And I think I capture some of that with some of my characters. And that's the great irony. In a city so large, some people are very lonely. And it's my home. And one of the things that becomes true to me for a story is by placing it in streets that I know, and places that I have been, and freeways I have driven, and restaurants I have been in, and art galleries I've been in. By placing it in places where I have walked, the stories become more real. So I have a story that takes place in Mexico City, so it's based on our travels to Mexico City a few years back. I have stories not in this collection. For example, I have one that takes place in different cities in New Mexico, and it was all based on my trip to that city with my family. And we did a beautiful driving trip in New Mexico, and so I took notes as we were driving, as we were traveling, and in order to try to capture certain elements to put into stories. But you know what? Any city can offer, pretty much food for thought and inspiration for our stories.
Thank you, Daniel.
Susan Platt wants to know, do you write all night with a demanding job like that during the day?
So no, I don't write all night. I'm a very fast writer. I write, I'll write in the evening or weekends or holidays. For example, when my wife and we did a little trip to Joshua Tree at the end of last year. We were out there for about a week. We had some downtime and I was working on a short story. And that's going to be published soon by a literary journal. And so I just kind of squeeze in whenever I can. I write in the short form. So I write short stories, I write poetry, I write essays. I don't write novels like War and Peace. I don't, maybe if I were a full-time writer, where that was my job, I would be able to do that. But I would find it very difficult to do that with the kind of demands I have with my day job. For example, writing a play even though it's a longer document and with longer narrative, I'm fairly fast at writing plays as well. I wrote Waiting for Gudinas in 13 days, and that's 13 days just in evenings and weekends.
That is fast.
So, but it was strong enough to get produced. It eventually got modified and expanded by another 12 pages, but that's what happens in rehearsal. That's what happens, in the reading process of a play. So I'm just a fairly fast, and I am a ruthless editor. I am not afraid to edit, and I think that's part of my training as a lawyer, because I'm always editing briefs and memos, and I just go in there and just change things and cut things, kill my darlings, and I do the same thing with my creative writing. Don't be afraid to
As
edit.
you should.
Yes.
Good for you. Do we have any more questions for Daniel?
Donna
Yes.
Miscolta.
Donna, who's a wonderful writer.
Yeah.
Hey, Donna.
Will you read that, or should I read that?
Yeah, you read it.
Let me find it here. Daniel, I stepped away for a bit, so I don't know if you discussed your past and present literary influences.
Oh, good question. So I went to high school in the 1970s, and I was at Stanford from 77 to 81. So the typical reading lists did not include writers of color. I mean, they were great writers, James Joyce and Somerset Maugham, and these were writers my dad read and really, appreciated. Willa Cather, Mark Twain, William Shakespeare, William Blake. It wasn't until later when, at age 39, as an adult, after already starting my legal profession, I decided I was going to start writing fiction. And I immersed myself in writers who were more similar to my culture, Sandra Cisneros and Rudy Anaya, people like that. And Amy Tan also is a favorite. And these are writers who talked about, the intersection of different cultures within the characters' lives. And so these stories spoke to me. And they also told me that these kind of stories can be told in a way that can be very powerful and very compelling. And so the very first book I wrote was in 1998. It was published in 2000 by Small Press. And it was titled, it's now out of print, but it was titled The Courtship of Maria Rivera Peña. It's a novella, and it's based on a family history of my grandparents moving to LA around 1920. And it's a very simple love story. It's not fancy. It's just a very straightforward love story, but it's placed in LA in the Mexican community with a lot of, and I did a lot of research about what LA was like in the 1920s. So, and currently, I look to people like Luis Rodriguez or Luis Urrea, Elena Viramontes. They're writers who there, and Estela is a wonderful writer, and Donna is a wonderful writer. So if I read other writers who are just wonderful writers, and Kathleen Alcalá is one of my influences too, because Kathleen has, you are able to use the vehicle of magical realism in a very powerful way, which is one of the elements, of course, I use in my writing. So I can look to people like you folks as role models. And I think that any quality writing, from any culture can become part of who you are as a writer. But it's also important, I think, to be able to read writers who connect with you on a cultural level. I think it's important to see what they're doing. and to see how they address certain issues. Because, when you grow up and you hear certain things and people use certain phrases and people do certain things, that's just your reality, right? That's just your life.
Right.
You don't think about it. And you have to make an effort to kind of remove yourself to be able to write about it, to pinpoint it and express it so that it is, becomes clear what the reality is that you're writing about, and what might be kind of normal everyday interactions for us might not be for other folks. Every culture has its way of talking and addressing certain issues. And, Estella and I could talk. I mean, one of the reasons why I love publishing Stella in an anthology, Latinos in Lotus Land, is because the characters in her story just reminded me of the women folks I grew up with. And
I was going to ask you, what year did that anthology come out?
That came out in 2008, and you're in it too.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a crazy story about the monkey house. Oh my gosh, that is a crazy story. I love it.
Well, I love the whole anthology, Latinos in Lotus Land, and that was from University of Arizona.
No, that's from Bilingual Press.
Oh, Bilingual Press, yeah.
Which is ASU, right?
Arizona State, yeah.
Exactly. So.
Yeah, that's a great. It's an honor to be associated with the other writers in that volume.
Someone wrote a question. Susan Platt wrote a question. Visual art as a reference point. You have some interesting art behind you.
Yes, we're enjoying your art, Danielle.
Oh, so my wife and I love art, and my wife in particular has a great eye, and she found these pieces. I have there are other pieces that I am responsible for, but luckily we have very similar taste. And art actually does play a role in some of my stories. I don't know if it's in this collection. I'm a little fuzzy right now because I have reviewed so many stories, and I've worked on another collection of stories. And there's a famous painting by Frida Kahlo where, Las Dos Fridas, where she is sitting side by side.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked that into a story because we saw the actual painting when we were in Mexico. And it's just a mind-blowing, is one of the most
This
powerful
is the one
paintings.
where she's in traditional dress in one side and in colonial dress in the other.
Yes. So she has her indigenous side and her colonized side. It's just a really beautiful painting. But I did put that painting into one of my stories. It kind of triggered. In fact, I wonder if, in fact, let me just check real fast.
I don't think it was. It's not in this.
It may not
collection.
be in this collection because I've been pulling together different stories for another collection, which we can talk about in a sec. But music also has inspired me. There are many references to jazz and to opera and to, I think Leela Downs several times is mentioned in one of the stories and some of her songs, because I listen to music when I'm writing.
Oh, you do?
So
Interesting.
I always have music. I can't function without having music always in the background. And so sometimes the music makes its way into the story. Sometimes they actually become the skeleton of a story. I have a story called Kinda Blue, which is about gang violence. And the beginning paragraph for each section is taken from the title of a track from that great album, from the great Miles Davis album, Kinda Blue. And so I use the album as the spine of my story, basically, and just let each title of each of the tracks become like a writing prompt for how the story was going to proceed. And that's because I was just listening to that album over and over again while I was writing. And I realized I need to write a story about this.
So tell us, is that what you're working on right now, or
No,
some other things?
I'm working on now, in reviewing my over 100 stories in order to produce this collection, how to date a flying Mexican. I realized that a lot of my stories also deal with love, and I had written in the last year or so 5 brand new stories about love. And so I decided to pull together a collection, and it is tentatively titled My Chicano Heart, New and Collected Stories of Love and Other Transgressions. And it's being read by a press right now. And it's in some ways would be a companion book to How to Date a Flying Mexican in the sense that it kind of grew in the same way, but it's more explicitly focused on it's not just romantic love, but also love of your children, or love of parents, or love of siblings, or platonic love with friends. So that's making its way hopefully to the bookshelves sometime in the next year or two. We'll see how that goes.
We'll look for that. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I think that's it for this evening. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope we answered most of your questions. Danielle, much success, I hope, accompanies this book, and we look forward to more books by you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Oh, and real fast, Audrey asked, do I write?
Yes.
I just write on Word. I don't do anything fancy. It's just a Word document. I open up a document, I come up with a title, and I just start. That's how I do it. Audrey, thank you for that question. Thank you to everyone who showed up, and everyone who's on Facebook who's watching. It's always a pleasure seeing you, Kathleen, and seeing you, Phoebe.
Well, we hope you make it to AWP in Seattle next year.
I just discovered that what your story about the shooting at the synagogue is in one of the issues of that we are covering for this anthology. Anyway, it was wonderful seeing you and everyone, and love you all. Thanks for coming, and hope you will come to our next podcast in June 18th, which is going to be talking to the women who are helping prostitution survivors, a lot of them who walk on Aurora Avenue in Seattle, some of them are 12 to 14 years old.
Yeah.
And that will be an interesting discussion about how they use art, especially visual art, but also writing, to heal people. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Powerful.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.